Hello and welcome to the ATA Developing Active Transportation Plan webinar. My name is Paula Hyman and I'm with the Ohio LTAP Center. I'm going to be your technical support for today's webinar. Just before we get started here, a couple of housekeeping items. If you have questions throughout this presentation, please type those into the questions box. Our presenters will address your questions periodically throughout the presentation. So if you can locate that now, go ahead and just type a hello, a hi in there, just so that we know you know where it's located and how to use it. This session is being recorded. Pending successful recording, we will provide this recording to everyone at the conclusion of day 2 of this training. I want to thank you in advance for your participation. And with that, I'll pass things off to Miss Amelia Mansfield, Planning and Communications Director at Burton Planning. Amelia?
Yes, thank you so much, Paula. Well, welcome to the Active Transportation Plan Development Guide webinar, number 1 of a series of 2. Next slide, please. Today, we're going to start off with a brief overview of the Active Transportation Academy, which is what this webinar is being offered through and in conjunction with, and that's when you'll be hearing from me. And then I'll turn it over to Michael Blau, who will be talking about some background as to why we're all here today, giving an overview of the Active Transportation Plan Development Guide, taking a deeper dive into what the guide includes, and priming us for the next webinar on October 5th that gets into more details. And then we'll be truthfully a fun activity at the end to gauge everyone's comprehension of what was shared during today's webinar, and to be sure that you're ready to move on to the 201 course next week. And then we'll finish with questions and answers as always. So again, my name is Amelia Mansfield. Michael Blau is my co-presenter. We together co-manage the Active Transportation Academy for Odot LTAP. A lot of you may have already heard or participated in ODOT's Active Transportation Academy. If you have, this is a refresher and an update on what we have to offer to you. If you are new to the Active Transportation Academy, hold on to your seats. There's a lot that we have to offer for you when it comes to assisting you and educating you on how to provide safe, efficient, and fun active transportation in your communities. The purpose of the Active Transportation Academy is to offer training to help communities such as yours reach your active transportation goals. These trainings are free as well as workshops. They're open to any local jurisdiction throughout Ohio. That can include townships, villages, cities, counties, and then also things, organizations and entities such as schools. These bring professional development credits to your table if that is something that you're seeking or is an incentive for you to participate. And if you want to learn more or apply to attend or host a training or workshop, you can click on this link below that will be sent out in the webinar notes. But you can also just Google ODOT Active Transportation Academy and it'll bring you there as well. We offer several types of course offerings through the Active Transportation Academy. The first is Instructor-Led Trainings, which is what it sounds like. There is an instructor that is teaching you about things, and this is either in person or live virtually. We offer community workshops that are more interactive and aim to result in a deliverable of some sort. There are multiple e-learning opportunities for you to self-guide yourself through different topics. And then there's archived material that we aren't currently offering through any of those first 3 course offering types, but are available to you to refer to. Instructor-led trainings are, as I had mentioned, a training that is 4 hours long, and it is with a instructor that is either in person or via web somehow. The offerings that we have for this are Complete Streets Policy Development, Crossing Guard Training, Girls in Gear, mobility solutions, transit's first and last mile, and walking school bus. The crossing guard training, Girls in Gear, and walking school bus are a train the trainer type of course that would be providing instruction to the attendees on how to then either train a crossing guard, operate a Girls in Gear program, or lead a walking school bus. Community workshops are the ones that are intended to be more in-depth and very customized to the host community. So if you were to apply to host one of these community workshops, we would be working with you ahead of time to tailor it to your current activities, the data that is relevant to your community, and ultimately working to help everyone who's in attendance to come together and produce some sort of deliverable by the end of the workshop, whether it's an outline for a plan or something else. You walk away with something tangible. So these are creating an active transportation plan, creating a school travel plan, creating a Vision Zero action plan, and conducting a walk audit. We have 5 e-learning offerings currently, and these range from multiple modules of about 45 minutes each to completing a full course in the matter of 1 hour to 3 hours. You can self-guide yourself. You can start and stop however frequently you want to. So if you want to do it over the course of 1 lunch, you can, or over the course of 3 months, you can as well. The e-learning course offerings are active transportation basics, safe routes to school basics, crossing guard training, advocating for active transportation, and community traffic calming programs. Active transportation basics and safe routes to school basics are prerequisites to host a community workshop. So someone from the host organization would be asked to complete one of those 2 e-learning courses before hosting the training. And then again, if you want to access any of these, you can follow the link below or Google Odot Active Transportation Academy e-learning, and you'll be able to find those. We have archived material, as I mentioned. They're listed here, so incorporating safe routes to school into wellness, school, and community policy and planning, safe routes to school lesson plans, and non-infrastructure toolkit. As we said, these all are very relevant and useful, and you're welcome to access them at any time. There are slide decks and supportive documentation. We aren't currently offering them as trainings, but we are happy to answer any questions you might have when you access those archive materials. If you want to apply, there's a brief form stack form for you to fill out and come prepared with thinking about when you might want to host the training and what your goals might be. And if you are currently working on any efforts that might be related to it, that's helpful for us to know off the bat. An ODOT representative will be in touch once you submit your form, and we'll start working with you to schedule that training or workshop. So if you have any questions, we're here throughout today's webinar. You're always welcome to reach out to us. And then with that, I'm going to pass it over to Michael.
All right, thanks Amelia for that introduction. Hi everyone, again, my name is Michael Blau. I am a senior planner at Toole Design, and I was the project manager for ODOT's Active Transportation Plan Development Guide. So just a few housekeeping items before I dive into things. I don't think that we'll be taking the full 90 minutes today, unless you all have a lot of questions, which would be great. But otherwise, we do have a lot of time reserved at the end for a fun trivia game. So please make sure you're paying attention, since there will be a quiz at the end. And we have a couple of spots throughout the presentation where I'll pause to field any questions. Otherwise, we'll have a longer Q&A session at the end as well. All right, so we're going to start off just with some background information about the need for the Active Transportation Plan Development Guide and why this is really important to develop at this time. So first off, ODOT's previous guide is 7 years old, and the state of active transportation planning has really evolved quite a bit since then, both in Ohio and at the national level, in terms of resources and standards and guidance. So we really needed a new document to reflect that evolution. We also saw a need for more coordination across the state. There are a a lot of local and regional planning agencies pursuing active transportation planning, as well as state partners like the Ohio Department of Health, which has funded a number of local active transportation plans in the last few years. So given all that activity, it really seems more important than ever to take a coordinated and informed approach to how we plan for active transportation across the state. And then lastly, the guide helps standardize components of active transportation plans, but it also allows for local ownership of the process. So it provides a template for how to approach this planning process with a comprehensive package of resources. But at the same time, it allows for customization based on communities' needs and where they find themselves in their active transportation planning process. So a little more background about how this guide relates to other active transportation efforts at ODOT. Walk Bike Ohio was recently completed. That is Ohio's first statewide bicycle and pedestrian plan, and it outlines what ODOT will be focused on to advance active transportation over the next 5 years. One of those programmatic areas of focus is planning and guidance. And having this recommended planning framework for active transportation definitely falls within that planning and guidance strategy from Walk Bike Ohio. ODOT has funded over a dozen local active transportation plans in the last few years and continues to fund many school travel plans and safe routes to school projects across the state. So again, a lot of active transportation activity being funded through ODOT. In 2019, the Office of Traffic Monitoring launched a non-motorized monitoring plan and database system using MS2 to help standardize and consolidate active transportation and volume data throughout the state. ODOT is also working to implement the state and US bike route system in Ohio. So central office is partnering with district bicycle and pedestrian coordinators and other stakeholders to implement that system. We currently have 5 US bike routes that were designated earlier this year throughout Ohio, with another 20 state bike routes and over 3,000 miles of on and off-road routes throughout the state. Funding streams for active transportation and safety improvements have increased, specifically through the Highway Safety Improvement Program and a number of other federal and state funding buckets that you can see here. This is a snapshot from Walk Bike Ohio's funding guide, so you can look there for more information. And lastly, ODOT is developing a multimodal design guide, which will really serve as sort of a complementary companion document to the AT Plan Development Guide. So this effort that we're talking about today is really just one piece of a comprehensive agency-wide effort to coordinate active transportation planning and design initiatives across the state. So a little background on the timeline for this project. We started working on the guide last fall and released it in August. During that time, we also developed an active transportation plan template, which you can see on the bottom there. That is an accompaniment to the guide, and we'll talk more about that at the next webinar on Tuesday. The guide development was really stakeholder driven. Before this project launched, ODOT heard from stakeholders that they needed more detailed and sophisticated planning tools to keep pace with best practices in active transportation planning. So we organized a set of regional roundtables in the fall of 2020 to better understand what those needs are, what they look like at various levels of government, with various levels of resources and funding constraints, et cetera. And we spoke with MPOs, RTPOs, ODOT district staff, local agency staff, advocates, and community-based organizations across the state. These are some of our key takeaways. Local and regional agencies were really looking for more direction on how to meaningfully engage the public during their AT planning processes. They're also looking to document both short-term priorities, low-hanging fruit, as well as longer-term aspirations within these plans. And then there was a consensus that these plans should serve as the comprehensive place for active transportation strategies, whether that's infrastructure projects, as well as non-infrastructure projects, policies, and programs. So I'm going to walk through each chapter of the guide. First, I just wanted to give you a little overview to help orient yourself. It's a lot to digest. The guide is almost 200 pages, including appendices. Fortunately, it's not meant to be read cover to cover. It's really more of a menu of options approach. So there's no need to read through the whole guide. The executive summary is a great way to get a handle on all the guide has to offer and figure out which chapters are specifically of interest to you. If you look at Chapter 3, Engage the Community, and Chapter 5, Assess Existing Conditions, those chapters really offer a menu of options for the communities pursuing active transportation plans based on their desired level of effort, their resource constraints, data availability, and a number of other factors. And this really allows communities to customize their planning efforts rather than using a one-size-fits-all approach. And then there are other chapters like Chapter 6, Identify Proposed Projects and Programs, and Chapter 7, Prioritize Proposed Projects, which offer more step-by-step guidance on ODOT's recommended approach to active transportation planning. So these chapters are a little bit more prescriptive in really trying to achieve that standardization across the state, but they still certainly allow communities to choose what makes the most sense for them. And we'll be covering chapters 1 through 5 today, and then we'll go through the remaining chapters next week. So there are a few other materials that really work hand in hand with the guide, which we're not going to talk about too much today, but I do want to make you aware of them since they correspond closely to what we're talking about today. And some parts of the guide make more sense, knowing that it's just one tool in a suite of resources. So one of those is the appendices. The guide includes almost 50 pages of appendices that cover a lot of different resources. It has a sample plan development schedule. It has a lot of additional options for existing conditions analyses, bicycle and pedestrian network data schema, and a lot of other helpful materials that are a little bit more technically oriented. We also developed an active transportation plan template, like I mentioned, for use by local and regional agencies as they follow the steps in the guide. So in some areas, that template provides more in-depth guidance. For example, it has a full-fledged facility toolkit in the recommendations section. And then in other areas, it just refers the user back to the guide for additional details. So these tools combined with the guide, again, will really help standardize active transportation planning at the local and regional levels, but also allowing users to develop more customized plans that meet their needs. The guide includes a lot of wayfinding features to help the reader navigate because it is such a large document. It uses these chapter icons and colors throughout to help orient you. And it also has a number of tables and icons and symbols to help navigate. So this is an example of that menu of options approach from Chapter 3, Community Engagement. And it uses icons and text to summarize some of the important information about each engagement strategy, as well as when to plug them into the planning process. And we'll talk more about this a little bit later. Same thing with Chapter 5, Existing Conditions. Again, you can see the use of icons and colors and text to help summarize each existing conditions analysis that the chapter discusses. And this is really meant to help the reader sort of quickly skim through their options before deciding which ones to read about in more detail, which ones might make more sense for their community. All right, so we're going to walk through each chapter, starting with Chapter 1, the introduction. Chapter 1 covers active transportation planning basics. So it explains the purpose of an AT plan, discusses AT plans at the local, regional, and state levels, and examines their relationship to other plans and initiatives like Vision Zero, Complete Streets, and Safe Routes to School. It also gives a brief overview of each subsequent chapter in the guide, and it really frames each chapter as a sort of a rational next step in developing an active transportation plan. So Chapter 1 calls out the guide's intended audience, which is primarily transportation practitioners who work at local and regional planning agencies, but also key stakeholders like health professionals, advocates, and elected officials. All of them might find the content in the guide useful as they're engaging in active transportation planning. This chapter also describes AT Plan's relationship to other multimodal transportation planning and safety initiatives. Like you can see on the right there, Vision Zero, Complete Streets, and Safe Routes to School. It also shows how AT plans are just one element of the larger family of planning documents and initiatives that many communities undertake, and it explains their importance and contribution to AT planning relative to these other documents, things like comprehensive plans, long-range plans, as well as some of the statewide efforts that you can see at the top there that Odot is leading. So before the planning process begins, the main participants really need to develop a common understanding of the objectives, the time frame, the focus, and the cost of the AT plan. And Chapter 2, Define the Scope, guides communities through these preliminary steps. It covers how to identify a geographic focus area for the plan, how to assess available resources, like whether you're using local agency staff versus a consultant team, what type of funding you have available, and what existing information or data you can feed into the plan. It also talks about how to identify a project team, and it lists the potential project team and stakeholder members, which we'll talk more about in a moment. And that section on identifying key stakeholders and audiences really emphasizes the importance of diversity among stakeholder or steering committee members, specifically racial diversity, since we know that communities of color rely more on active transportation. They've suffered disproportionately from traffic violence, and they've often historically been excluded from transportation planning. So really just emphasizing the importance of a diverse group of stakeholders to guide the planning process. Like I mentioned, Chapter 2 talks about those key players. So potential project team members and stakeholders are listed here. There are several different ways to manage the development of active transportation plans. You can use a project management team, you can have steering committees or advisory teams. Typically, you want to rely on a mix of these approaches. Project management teams oversee the day-to-day decisions related to the plan. They manage staff time and resources and the budget, and just make sure that the plan is progressing on schedule. A steering committee or an advisory team provides input at key milestones. So this group really embodies the local expertise and priorities of the community, and they help the rest of the team understand what the local problems and opportunities and constraints are. And this group can also use their own influence and leverage within the community to promote the plan and help support community engagement. Outside the steering committee, we have other key stakeholders who tend to be less intimately involved in the planning process. These are typically elected officials or other decision makers and local influencers. Although in some cases they may serve directly in these groups or in the project management team, especially in smaller communities, it's more common to have more direct involvement from those local leaders. And then lastly, we have the public. We'll talk much more about the public's role and how to engage the community when we get to Chapter 3. Chapter 2 ends with a recommended plan development schedule that incorporates all the steps listed throughout the guide in developing an AT plan and really shows how they all relate to and build upon one another. So this graphic on the right shows a medium to high level of effort plan schedule. And it's important to note that a lot of these steps are iterative rather than strictly linear. So for example, assessing existing conditions and identifying proposed projects can be a circular process if you need to go back and gather additional data as you identify projects. So this is really just a sort of a framework to customize as your community needs. And this section also talks about how critical dates may drive the overall timeline, things like funding application deadlines, mandatory public comment periods, review periods for governing bodies, et cetera. Timelines can vary widely as well, depending on the geography of the plan and some of these other critical factors, like funding deadlines. So active transportation plans can take anywhere from 6 months for a fairly streamlined planning process to 1 or more years for a more complex effort. All right, Chapter 3, Engage the Community. So engagement is a really critical piece of the planning process, and we want to make sure that we're capturing broad and representative community feedback, but also prioritizing specific voices that need to be heard. And we need to prioritize engagement because we tend to have limited time and budgets when it comes to these types of planning tasks. So being deliberate in engaging groups that you need to hear from and really building an engagement strategy around the convenience and the interests of that particular audience is really important. This chapter starts with an overview of engagement during the plan development process. It shows how it relates to other chapters and steps of the process, from defining the scope all the way through to implementing the plan. It includes a menu of engagement strategies, which we'll talk more about in a moment, and it also discusses the need for ongoing engagement after the plan is completed, as well as legal requirements that might impact public engagement, like Title VI and NEPA. So historically, genuine and effective public engagement in transportation plans and projects has been really difficult to achieve. In recent years, we've seen a shift in the industry from simple public outreach, where the public is notified of decisions that have already been made, to a much more collaborative and empowering set of engagement strategies. The International Association of Public Participation developed this graphic, which is included in the guide, and that captures the shift that I'm talking about and really shows the spectrum of influence that the public can have over planning or decision-making processes. It identifies these 5 levels of public participation, starting with inform, and then moving up to consult, involve, collaborate, and empower. And Odot's Active Transportation Guide recommends that we strive for planning processes to fall under those last 2 categories of really meaningful and profound public engagement, where we're collaborating with and empowering community members. The chapter also covers several important elements of meaningful community engagement, which we'll walk through now. In many cases, the project team might lack important expertise that's necessary to understand their community members' transportation challenges. So, for example, most transportation professionals tend to be highly educated. We tend to be whiter and more male than the general population, and we often have access to vehicles for travel and other resources. And that means that on many of our projects, we're missing the lived experiences of people who are low income, people who rely on transit or active transportation, people with disabilities, or Black, Indigenous, or other people of color. And this really speaks to a larger issue of lack of representation in the transportation industry. But for the purposes of active transportation planning, community engagement is a great way to address this gap in experience. So if we can rely on local knowledge and expertise from people who know the transportation system, very intimately and rely on it every day, that can complement our technical expertise and understanding, and really gives us an opportunity to reflect the priorities of those groups in the final plan. I already mentioned the shift from outreach to collaboration that we've seen in recent years. So engagement means that we're not just telling the public what we've already decided is best for them. We're really trying to provide a forum for cooperative discussions and negotiations and agreements. And most importantly, this approach really seeks to incorporate community values and needs into transportation improvements and into every part of the planning process. I can say that, personally, the strongest and the most successful active transportation plans that I've worked on have integrated public feedback into every step of the planning process, from, even before the plan is launched, as in this example shown here from Perry County, all the way through to implementation and once the plan is adopted. Overcoming opposition is another important element to consider, and it needs to be done in a respectful and genuine way. And that's really a key step towards consensus building and public ownership of the final plan. So we have to identify and engage with sources of potential opposition as early as possible to understand and address those concerns. And I can't emphasize enough that active and respectful listening is essential here, to really make sure that we're understanding what the community concerns are. It's also really helpful to have knowledge of previous transportation projects and plans and how those engagement efforts went, whether or not they were successful, to sort of understand the history and the context of the community. And, you know, it's important to remember that transportation practitioners are bound to work in service to the community. And that's a useful frame when we're trying to address concerns and work to overcome opposition. Really trying to create an inviting space to work through conflict can help keep people engaged and really benefit the planning process. Engaging early and strategically is another important element. So this needs to begin as early as possible in the plan development process. The sooner that stakeholders are identified and involved, the fewer problems are likely to arise as the plan progresses. A bit of caution about using the term best practices in active transportation. So we tend to idolize European solutions and use examples from European countries a lot when it comes to bicycle and pedestrian facilities. And that's not to say that we can't learn anything from Europe, but there are a lot of great examples all over the world, not just in predominantly wealthy and whiter European countries. And they're probably great examples that are much closer to the communities we're working in, that are more relevant and more culturally appropriate. So for example, in a Latinx or Spanish-speaking community, they might find this two-way separated cycle track from Bogota to be more inspiring than an example from Copenhagen. Likewise, on the bottom, if I'm working in a rural community in Ohio and I'm talking about trails, I would show this picture of Marion County, which has a very similar built environment and transportation network to a lot of other rural communities in Ohio. So just trying to think strategically about what images you're showing to help sort of validate and relate to the community that you're speaking with. Compensating the public for participating. So this can take several different forms, but you know, whether it's offering free childcare so parents can participate in meetings, gift cards, or sometimes it's just straight up cash. We need to acknowledge the community's expertise and ability to solve their own problems with our support and pay them accordingly. Our local partner for the Perry County Active Transportation Plan, which we completed a couple of years ago, was the health department, and they had a budget for cash giveaways for people who spoke with us at community events, which was really helpful in generating enthusiasm and excitement about participating in the planning process. And then lastly, engaging community-based organizations. These types of grassroots organizations can really play an important role as trusted gatekeepers in the community and help you connect to the stakeholders that you need to speak with and involve. So ensuring that community-based partners have the resources they need to achieve their own agendas and support you in your active transportation planning, you know, whether that's promotional materials in different languages or space to hold meetings, whatever the case is, just making sure that you're fostering those relationships, not only for active transportation planning, but for other benefits as well. These are just a few of the community-based organizations who have participated in AT planning in Ohio. And so before we move on to the strategies in this chapter, just a note on disability inclusion during community engagement. So nearly everybody will have a disability that impacts their mobility or their cognitive ability at some point in their lives. And accommodating people with disabilities in active transportation networks is especially important for that reason. We also need to include people with disabilities in the planning process itself. They can speak from their own experiences on how to make plans and designs more accessible. And that can lead to better results for everyone, for people of all ages and abilities. So we should make sure that all project events, activities, and materials are accessible, whether that's sign language interpretation, holding meetings and other activities in accessible locations, or providing ADA document accessibility for websites, PDFs, and other digital materials. All of these things can help engage people with disabilities in the planning process. This is an innovative example from a workshop that used tactile graphics to convey street designs for people with vision disabilities. So like I mentioned earlier, the bulk of Chapter 3 focuses on 17 different engagement strategies, a snippet of which are shown here. and they're organized along a spectrum of potential reach from targeted audiences to broad participation. The guide uses icons to show typical cost and effectiveness of reaching underrepresented communities, as well as when to use these strategies during the plan development process. To give you an example, for interactive informative games, you can see that it's a medium cost, high reach of underrepresented communities, and is typically used during the vision and goals, existing conditions, and recommendations steps of active transportation plan development. All right, I want to pause before we move on to the last couple of chapters and see if there are any questions in the chat.
No outstanding questions that I can see, Michael.
Okay, great. So we'll have another opportunity for questions after the last couple chapters, and then we'll move on to our activity. All right. Chapter 4, develop a vision and goals. Chapter 4 is pretty straightforward. It discusses how to use a vision statement and a set of goals or objectives to deliver a compelling message that really sets the stage, intent, and tone for the entire planning effort. So it's important to do this early on in the planning process. The chapter discusses different strategies and approaches for developing visions and goals, including community engagement, as well as looking at other plans and policies that are already adopted in your community to see if there's anything that's transferable to your active transportation plan. And this chapter ends with several examples of visions and goals from active transportation plans around Ohio, both at the regional, countywide, and municipal scales. All right, so moving on to Chapter 5, assess existing conditions. Chapter 5 is a doozy. It's almost 50 pages, and it covers a lot of technical content. But again, like I mentioned at the beginning, you should really treat this chapter as a menu of options, not something that needs to be read the whole way through, unless you're particularly interested by all of these analysis options. The chapter includes guidance on preparing data and creating a base map, using tools like TIMS and GCAT, as well as census data and other sources. It also discusses how to review existing plans, policies, and supported programs, and includes a list of different types of plans and studies that communities may want to consider in their research. And then lastly, the bulk of the chapter focuses on 29 different analyses that could be included in an existing conditions assessment, and we'll go into more detail on that in a moment. The first section on preparing data and creating the base map talks about the type of information you want to show in your mapping. Obviously, things like existing bicycle and pedestrian facilities, but also transit facilities and routes, crashes, traffic volumes, other characteristics of the roadway network that might be useful in AT planning. It also links to TIMS, which is Odot's web mapping portal, transportation information mapping system. And TIMS contains many of the data sets that are relevant to active transportation planning. And then GCAT, which is Odot's GIS crash analysis tool, is another really helpful resource. So beyond the Odot resources, it's important to get a handle on the quality of data available in your community and really understand early on in the process whether it's sufficient for the purposes of your plan, because these data will enable a lot of the existing conditions analyses that the guide recommends. So I mentioned some of the transportation roadway network features that you want to capture in your mapping, but understanding your community's demographics is equally important. Demographics can have a really strong impact on your approach to public engagement, on your proposed active transportation network and recommendations, as well as just your fundamental success in generating community support to implement the active transportation plan. The guide explains that at a minimum, you want to consider income and poverty, race and ethnicity, housing and transportation characteristics, age and disability status when you're reviewing demographics in your community. The next section is a plan and policy review, and this type of review summarizes active transportation and related efforts to date in your community and frames the current planning process as a logical next step in your community's active transportation evolution. This section of the guide discusses what types of plans to consider reviewing, which local organizations might be involved in leading non-infrastructure initiatives that you need to be aware of, and considering your community's historical context while you develop your plan. If your community has them, you want to consider including some of the following types of plans, policies, and programs in your review, everything from comprehensive plans and transportation plans to more neighborhood level plans or corridor studies, as well as subdivision regulations, zoning codes, and other regulatory tools that might impact bicycle and pedestrian planning. It's really important to understand your community's historical context and the disparities that affect people while they travel. So in large cities, that means examining how both historical and contemporary trends, things like segregation, urban renewal, gentrification, the over-policing of communities of color, all these things have impacted people's ability to travel safely and comfortably, and that directly affects our active transportation planning efforts. Likewise, in rural communities, things like population loss, disinvestment, abandonment, public health crisis spurred by opioid addiction, all these things have caused a lot of harm and trauma in certain communities. And active transportation plans are really an opportunity to acknowledge the historical disadvantages that these communities face and use them as a tool to help improve quality of life and long-term economic outcomes for Ohio's rural residents, as well as disadvantaged communities in urban areas as well. So really including the historical context analysis in your plan and policy review can help set the tone for the remainder of your policy. Along with an equitable engagement approach, it can help encourage those who have been poorly represented in past planning processes or feel marginalized by past planning projects to participate in this process and have their voices fully represented in the final active transportation plan. Like I mentioned, the main reason that this chapter is so long is because the Conducting Analyses section provides a comprehensive toolkit of analyses for communities to consider in assessing their active transportation conditions. And the analyses are organized by Walk Bike Ohio goal area, which is shown here. So equity, network utilization, network connectivity, safety, livability, and preservation. For a balanced approach to active transportation planning, Odot recommends some level of analysis and consideration for each of these goal areas. And Chapter 5 includes several options for each one. A lot of the analyses include step-by-step guidance and tips on how to complete them, as well as available resources. Some of them also include case studies from around Ohio and across the country to show how these types of analyses have been used in the past. A summary table lists all the analyses, a sample of which is shown here, and it shows the level of effort needed to complete each one, as well as the data requirements and data complexity, and its importance to the overall planning process. And it's important to note that the guide defines each of these categories. So the reader will fully understand what to expect from a medium level of effort analysis with high data requirements and medium data complexity, for example. All of those things are clearly defined and laid out in the guide. The section starts off with some more low effort analyses that can be paired with community engagement to help inform existing conditions. And the value of these exercises is that they really prioritize community members' lived experiences as essential data in assessing existing conditions. And that's especially important in under-resourced communities that have been excluded from past planning projects. So these are activities like walk audits, bike rides, group mapping exercises to help uncover some of the opportunities and challenges in active transportation in your community. And then on the other end of the spectrum, we have much more data-driven and complex tasks. This is an example of a more detailed analysis description that includes a case study. The bicycle level of traffic stress analysis is a medium level of effort option with high data complexity and high data requirements. And the guide recommends an LTS analysis as an important step to enable a more nuanced understanding of the bicycle network, and also allows for some more farther advanced and complex analysis down the road if your community chooses that route. It's important to take enough time and resources to really gain a firm understanding of walking and biking conditions in your community. Since this is one of the earlier steps in the planning process, a really thorough and thoughtful existing conditions analysis can help pay dividends later on. It can help you develop more informed and nuanced recommendations and gain support for plan adoption and implementation. But again, there's no one-size-fits-all approach to conducting existing conditions analyses. If your community is in the early stages of improving active transportation, you may find that a handful of basic tasks provides enough information to develop an AT plan. Communities that are farther along might prefer more advanced methods of analyzing their active transportation systems. And this graphic shows how low, medium, and high effort existing conditions analyses may come together to inform the overall planning process. There's not inherently more value in the higher effort example than the other ones. It all really just depends on what your community needs to keep moving active transportation forward. So again, I will pause here and see if we have any further questions. I see one question in the chat that's asking, can you explain farther what the Complete Streets policy development looks like? So like I mentioned earlier, Complete Streets is a related initiative to active transportation planning. It can run parallel to developing an AT plan. Oftentimes the development of a Complete Streets policy might come first. And what that looks like is really a lot of collaboration and consensus building between different departments in your community. So, public works, engineering, parks and rec, any agency or department that really touches a right-of-way, understanding what types of systems and processes and policies they need to have in place to enable complete streets, whether that's thinking about maintenance practices for bicycle and pedestrian facilities, or how to incorporate active transportation amenities in street resurfacing. There are a lot of different ways you can approach this. But typically in Ohio, a Complete Streets policy is a fairly standard document, maybe 6 to 10 pages, that outlines the community's goals around accommodating people of all ages and abilities and all modes, including biking, walking, transit, freight, people with disabilities, as well as private vehicles, and trying to examine their current policies and practices to understand what needs to change to better accommodate all of those modes. So again, it's really sort of a consensus building process at the beginning, which may lead to a more robust or fully fledged active transportation plan or Complete Streets plan farther down the road. And it's also important to note that you really need to have your elected officials, your council members, your other decision makers involved in the process to make sure that they understand the value and the importance of Complete Streets, and to prepare them for adopting a Complete Streets resolution when the time comes. Are there any other questions or comments that have come through?
We do not have any in the questions pod.
All right. Great. Well, in that case, it sounds like we are ready for our activity. So let me go on to the next slide. All right. So we're going to play Who Wants to Be an Active Transportation Genius? And since there are not too many questions, I assume you all are going to ace this quiz. We're going to play, again, Who Wants to Be an Active Transportation Genius? And before we get started, I should just emphasize that really there are no right or wrong answers. When it comes to active transportation planning, there's a lot of flexibility in developing an active transportation plan, and this recommended guidance is really meant to be used, as you see fit. But when it comes to the guide itself, there are some right or wrong answers here as they relate to the contents of the guide and the slides that I just showed you. So the way this is going to work is that once all the answer options are shown for a particular question, you'll have about 10 seconds to make a choice. If you think you know the answer, you can use the hand raise function in GoToWebinar, and then I will randomly call on someone who has their hand raised and unmute you so that you can respond. If that person has the right answer, then we'll move on to the next question. If not, I will pick a second person to attempt to answer, and after the second person answers, we'll just move on regardless, and I'll reveal the answer. So take a minute just to find the hand raise function and make sure you understand where that is and how it works so that you can participate. And I should say there are no incentives or awards for this game, unfortunately, other than the title of Active Transportation Genius. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and move to the next slide. So first question, which of the following was not an impetus for a new active transportation guide? A, Odot's previous guide is 7 years old. B, more coordination was needed. C, it was required by FHWA. Or D, there was a need to standardize components of AT plans. So if you think you know the answer, take a moment and raise your hand. All right, I'm going to pick Vivian Taylor. So Vivian, I'll go ahead and unmute you. Or you can, you should be able to unmute yourself and what the answer is.
I want to say the answer is C.
That is correct. C is right. It is not required by the FHWA to have an active transportation guide. All right. Good job. Thank you, Vivian. Okay, so moving on to the next question. Which of the following is not an active transportation related initiative? Is it A, complete streets, B, Vision Zero, C, safe routes to school, or D, transportation systems management and operations? So I'll give you about 10 seconds. If you think you know the answer, go ahead and raise your hand. All right, I'm going to select Tom Arnold. So go ahead and unmute yourself.
Okay, I'm going to go with D, TSMO.
That is correct. TSMO is not an transportation related initiative. Good job, Tom. All right, you guys are 2 for 2. So moving on to question 3. I'm sorry you can't hear the dramatic music playing in the background because that makes it a lot more exciting, but hopefully we'll have that figured out for the next webinar on Tuesday. Question 3, which types of engagement should AT plans strive to achieve? A, inform and consult. B, consult and involve. C, notify and cooperate. Or D, collaborate and empower. All right. So I am going to select, let's see who we have here. How about Letitia Satina?
Yeah, I think it's D, collaborate and empower.
That's correct. Good job. All right. Let me lower everybody's hands. Okay. The next question. What types of incentives or compensation should we offer to the public to participate in the AT planning process? A, free childcare, gift cards or cash. B, continuing education credits. C, an all expenses paid vacation to Hawaii. Or D, puppies. All right, let's see who has their hands raised. All right, and I will go with Amy this time.
A.
Yes, good job, Amy. A is the right answer. All right, moving on to question 5. What does TIM stand for? A, transportation in multimodal settings. B, transnational incidents caused by malicious skunks. C, thermal infrared mapping spectrometer. Or D, transportation information mapping systems. All right. So how about Stacy has her hand raised? What do you think the answer is, Stacy? Stacy, I didn't hear your answer, although it looked like you were unmuted. Do you want to try one more time? Still not coming through. Let's see who else had their hand raised. All right, I'm not sure who else had their hand raised, so let's go with Amy again. Amy, do you have the answer?
D.
D is correct. Although if anybody had picked B, I would have given it to you anyway. All right. So moving on to the next question. All right. Which of the following is not an example of understanding historical context? A, segregation. B, population loss. C, needs assessment. Or D, urban renewal. Take a few moments and raise your hand if you think you know the answer. I'm not seeing any hands raised. Does anyone think they know the answer? All right, let's go with Donald. Donald, what do you think the answer is?
Need assessment, C.
That is correct. Needs assessment is not an example of understanding historical context. So good job. Thank you, Donald. All right, moving on to question 7. Which of the following is a Walk Bike Ohio goal? A, livability. B, synergy. C, accessibility. Or D, sustainability. Raise your hand if you think you know the answer. All right, how about Letitia this time? Letitia, do you have the answer? All right, I'm not hearing anything come through. Okay, it sounds like she's having trouble unmuting. Is there anybody else who wants to try? Go ahead and raise your hand again if you think you know the answer. All right, Stacy, the floor is yours. Stacy, do you think you know the answer? Okay, I'm not hearing anything either, so I'm just going to go ahead and show the correct answer, which is A, livability. All right, moving on to question 8. How does the guide describe a bicycle level of traffic stress analysis? A, low effort, medium data complexity, low data requirements. B, medium effort, high data complexity, high data requirements. C, high effort, medium data complexity, high data requirements. Or D, high effort, high data complexity, high data requirements. Ooh, that's a mouthful. All right, so you really had to be paying attention for this one or have the guide open. Let's see if anyone has the answer. All right, Amy, what do you think the answer is?
B.
B is correct. Great job, Amy. All right. So next question. What are the 3 levels of active transportation planning described in the guide? A, neighborhood, local, and regional. B, regional, statewide, and national. C, local, regional, and statewide. Or D, national, international, and intergalactic. So if you think you know the answer, go ahead and raise your hand. All right. Donald, what do you think the answer is?
A, neighborhood, local, regional.
Actually, that is not the right answer. Sorry, Donald. Does anybody else want to give this one a try? All right, I don't see any other hands, so I'll go ahead and reveal the answer. It is C, local, regional, and statewide. Statewide because we want to consider Walk Bike Ohio and some of the other Odot-led initiatives. All right, next question. Which of the following is not a common key stakeholder in active transportation planning? A, organized labor, B, boards of developmental disabilities, C, representatives of under-resourced communities, or D, boards of regions? All right, how about Vivian this time?
I want to go with boards of regents.
That
It's either that or
is
A.
correct. Yep, good job, Vivian.
Thanks.
All right, yes, all these other three were on the list for common key stakeholders. So moving on to number 11. Which of the following is a related active transportation initiative at ODOT? Implementation of the Ohio Rail to Trail system, B, implementation of the state and U.S. bike route system, C, implementation of the active transportation asset management system, or D, implementation of the pedestrian activity monitoring system? I'll give everyone a moment to consider. All right, let's go back to Donald for this one. Donald, what do you think the answer is? Sorry, Donald, say it again. I'm not hearing anything. Let's try Vivian. Vivian, do you have the answer?
You know, I forgot that I didn't lower my hand, but I can figure it out. Which of the following is related active transportation initiative at ODOT? Oh. Is it related? I want to say all of them. I'm going to go with B for right now.
B? Okay, your intuition was right. It is B. Good job. So yeah, all these other ones sound plausible, but B is actually the only one that is currently happening. All right. I'm sorry, I forgot to lower everybody's hand. I think that's where the confusion was. So a few more questions to go. Number 12. What is an essential part of mitigating opposition to active transportation plans? A, empathetic and genuine facilitating, B, active and respectful listening, C, quiet and peaceful meditating, or D, enthusiastic smiling and nodding? So please raise your hand if you think you know the answer. All right, Letitia, what do you think the answer is?
Active and respectful listening, B.
B, that is correct. Good job. All right. So we reached the penultimate question, number 13. What would be the most relevant and culturally appropriate example of a bike facility to show at a public meeting in Dayton? A, a bike facility from Columbus. B, a bike facility from Copenhagen. C, a bike facility from Dayton. Or D, a bike facility from Daytona. Give you all a few seconds to put your hands up if you think you know the answer. All right, Amy, the floor is yours. What do you think the answer is?
A.
I think I heard C, which is correct. Good job. So again, just trying to make our examples as locally relevant and context sensitive as possible. So looking from within the community is a great place to start. All right, and our last question. Which of the following is not a common type of plan to review during an existing conditions assessment? A, a community mobility plan. B, a traffic calming plan. C, a recreation and trails plan. Or D, a freight plan. So take a moment and raise your hand if you think you know the answer. All right, how about Grace? What do you think the answer is? Grace, you should be able to unmute yourself if you have the answer.
Is it D?
It is D. A freight plan is typically not part of existing conditions assessment. All right. Those are all the questions I have. Great job, everyone. Thank you for humoring me with something a little bit different. I hope you all enjoyed this. So switching back to our presentation, just a couple of wrap-up items. Our next webinar is on next Tuesday, October 5th from 1 to 2:30. It covers chapters 6 through 8 of the guide and the active transportation plan template. So thank you all very much for joining. If you want to check out the guide, you can use this link down here, or you can just Google Odot Active Transportation Plan Development Guide, and that should take you to the appropriate page. Amelia and I will stay on for a little while. If anyone has further questions or comments, be happy to chat. Otherwise, you are welcome to sign off if you need to go. So thanks again for joining.
We don't have questions in the questions pod. Again, next session is going to be Tuesday, October 5th, starting at 1 p.m.